You know, usually when we talk about diagnosing a problem, whether that's in a human body or in society, there's this baseline expectation of absolute precision.
Right, like an engineering mindset.
Exactly. It's like you fall off your bike, your arm hurts, you go to the hospital. The X-ray shows that stark, jagged white line across your bone, and the doctor just points at the glowing screen and says, well, there it is. That's the problem.
Yeah, it's a completely binary state, broken or not broken.
Right? It's clean, it's undeniable, and I think psychologically speaking, that is incredibly comforting for us.
Oh, absolutely. As human beings, we desperately want things to be visible. We want our problems to be easily categorized, put into neat little boxes and addressed with a standardized protocol.
But then you step out of the emergency room and back into the real world. You step into the world of, say, neurodevelopment or generational trauma, or you step into the incredibly messy, volatile realities of our modern political culture, or the deep mysteries of quantum physics.
And suddenly that pristine X-ray machine is completely broken.
Totally broken. We aren't looking at clean, jagged lines anymore. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, well, honestly, it's just murky.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. And the terrifying part is that the people in charge, the institutions we rely on, they often pretend the waters are perfectly clear.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that is exactly why we are here today. Welcome, everyone, to a very special morning roundup edition of The Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
If you're new here, or if you're just listening to this on your morning commute wondering how to make sense of the absolute chaos in your newsfeed, here is our mission. Every single day, we scan a massive stack of the day's sources. And today, I gotta tell you, we've got a wild stack.
It's a heavy one today.
Yeah, we were talking about intense, violent political protests on the streets of London. We're looking at deeply personal, almost disturbing parenting confessions from the pages of the New York Times. We've got highly technical scientific controversies that challenge our understanding of biology and profound theological insights from the front lines of ancient faiths.
And our morning roundup philosophy is pretty straightforward, right? It's something we take very seriously. We aren't here to give you safe, heavily sanitized, caveat-filled commentary.
No sugarcoating.
Exactly. We're not a PR firm for any political party or scientific institution. We are here to impartially present the raw, sometimes highly uncomfortable information found at our sources. We're going to connect the dots across these wildly different disciplines. We're probably going to push your buttons a little bit, and then we're going to leave you with actionable steps.
You get to decide how you feel about it, because sometimes having your worldview actively challenged is the single most important thing you can do for your intellectual health.
So true.
So let's look at the thread tying all these sources together today. The overarching theme for today's deep dive is what we are calling the battle for reality. Institutional control versus individual responsibility.
I like that title.
Right. Throughout this hour, we're going to explore how massive top-down systems, through the manipulation of science, politics, and technology, attempt to dictate the very nature of our reality. They want to define the rules of the game so you don't have to.
And conversely, we're going to look at how true sovereignty, like true freedom, requires taking radical, sometimes painful personal responsibility in our families, our faith, and our own minds.
It is a fascinating and kind of terrifying tension. On one hand, you have massive institutions, governments, academia, tech monopolies trying to engineer a perfectly ordered, frictionless society.
And on the other hand, you have the inherently messy, chaotic, beautiful reality of human subjectivity just violently pushing back against that control.
Right. So let's begin at the macro level. Segment 1, the engineers of reality. We're starting with how elites and institutions attempt to explain and control the fundamental rules of life itself.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, and to do that, we are starting with a biological mystery that I have to admit I had never even heard of until we review today's sources. It's a concept called chirality.
Yes, chirality, also known as handedness. It is one of the most profound, unexplained mysteries in the entire field of biology.
Okay, so let me set the stage for you listening. Our source here is the brilliant theoretical physicist Sabine Hossenfelder, and she breaks down this peculiar property of life on Earth. Basically, many biological molecules come in mirror image versions.
Right. They have the exact same parts, the exact same chemical connections, but they aren't the exact same shape.
How does that work exactly?
Well, a good way to visualize this is just to look at your hands. Your left hand and your right hand are made of the same components, right? 4 fingers, 1 thumb, a palm.
Okay, yeah.
They are perfect mirror images of each other. But you cannot perfectly superimpose your left hand onto your right hand. If you lay them both palms down on a table, the thumbs point in opposite directions. They are fundamentally asymmetric.
Oh, exactly. It's like trying to put your right shoe on your left foot. It has all the same materials, leather, rubber, laces,
Ah.
but the geometry of the shoe actively rejects your foot. That is chirality.
Yes, great analogy. And what's fascinating and kind of creepy is that life on Earth uses only one version of these molecules.
Wait, really? Just one?
Just one. Sabine points out that RNA and DNA, the fundamental building blocks of our genetic code, use entirely right-handed sugars. And the proteins that do all the work in our bodies, they use entirely left-handed amino acids.
Which is an astonishing statistical anomaly, because in a vacuum, if you synthesize these molecules in a chemistry lab, you naturally get a 50-50 mix of left-handed and right-handed versions, right?
Exactly. The laws of chemistry don't inherently prefer one over the other, yet the machinery of biological life on Earth is completely 100% exclusive to one specific handedness.
And Sabine points out that the mirror image version of life is chemically just as possible as ours. So why do we only see this one specific version? Why did biology become so dogmatic?
She poses a massive philosophical and scientific question here. If the reason for this chirality is universal-like, if it's based on some fundamental underlying law of physics we just don't fully understand yet, then life on other planets, if it exists, would have to be exactly the same.
But if it's not a universal law,
Mm.
if it is just a random coincidence,
Then it's just a bizarre quirk of Earth's specific evolutionary history where one type of molecule just happened to win the early chemical lottery. And if that's the case, then alien life could evolve completely differently.
meaning they might look the same on a macro level, but behave fundamentally differently on a molecular level.
Right.
Sabine actually jokes in her video that she personally hopes molecules don't have the same handedness everywhere. Because if alien biology uses left-handed sugars and right-handed amino acids, then at least an invading alien species might have to think for a moment before they decide to eat us,
That's hilarious.
right? Our molecules wouldn't be compatible with their biology. We would basically be molecularly indigestible.
It's a funny thought, a sort of cosmic defense mechanism. But the underlying science trying to answer this question is dead serious. And it has frustrated chemists for decades.
I bet.
For a long time, the best institutional explanation for this single chirality phenomenon was what we can call the magnetic rocks theory.
Okay, so the idea was that billions of years ago on early Earth, there were these naturally magnetic rocks, like certain iron-containing compounds.
Yeah.
And as complex molecules were forming and crystallizing in the primordial soup, these magnetic rocks acted as a sort of scaffolding. And the theory proposed that the chirality of the molecules that successfully synthesized depended on the specific direction of the magnetization of the rocks they were forming on.
Right. The thought was that over millions of years, this gave one chirality a tiny competitive advantage, which eventually snowballed into total biological dominance.
It sounds plausible at first glance, but Sabine notes the fatal glaring flaw in that institutional theory. It doesn't actually solve the problem, does it?
No, it just kicks the scientific can down the road. Because if you say, well, the molecules are right-handed because the rocks were magnetized a certain way, the immediate next question is, okay, why was one magnetization of rocks more common or more likely than the other?
Right. You can't just blame the Earth's global magnetic field, because as Sabine points out, the Earth's magnetic field is incredibly weak on a molecular level. It's not uniform everywhere on the planet, and it constantly shifts and flips its poles over geologic time.
So the magnetic rock theory totally falls apart under scrutiny.
Which brings us to the core of this source. A brand new, highly publicized scientific paper that claims to have finally, definitively solved the mystery of chirality.
And this is where the institutional narrative gets incredibly interesting and highly questionable. The authors of this new study make a bold claim. They state that one chirality of molecules is simply objectively better at transporting electrons, period.
Okay, so to test this bold claim, the researchers set up an experiment. They created what are called chiral gold films. Now, as Sabine explains, gold by itself isn't normally chiral.
Right, it's symmetrical.
But they grew these microscopic gold films in chemical solutions that contained either left-handed or right-handed tartaric acid. This chiral additive was supposed to bias the microscopic crystalline structure of the gold as it formed.
So they essentially force the gold to have a handedness.
Exactly. Then they send an electric current through the gold film and measured the sideways voltage to see how efficiently the electrons move through the material.
Now remember, chemistry at its core is essentially just the study of where electrons like to go. If one geometric shape transports electrons significantly better than its mirror image, that would explain everything.
It would mean that chemical reactions in the primordial soup would universally favor the more efficient chirality.
And guess what? The researchers published their paper claiming exactly that. They found that the left-handed and right-handed gold samples gave opposite directions of current, which was totally expected based on their geometry.
But crucially, the researchers claimed the currents were not of equal size. They stated that one version wasn't just the mirror image, it was objectively, measurably better at transporting electrons.
Headline generated, mystery solved, published the paper in a prestigious journal.
Yes, if it were actually true.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because Sabine Hossenfelder, who is a rigorous, no-nonsense theoretical physicist, drops the absolute hammer on this paper.
She does. She looks at this highly celebrated biological study, looks at the math, and publicly states that she is giving it a 9 out of 10 on the BS meter.
Wow. 9 out of 10.
Her physical arguments against the paper are brutal and methodical. She states unequivocally that according to the known laws of electromagnetism, these currents should have the exact same magnitude. The left-handed structure and the right-handed structure are perfect mirror images. The efficiency of electron transport must be symmetrical. Now, the authors of the paper knew this was a problem, so they try to hand-wave it away in the text by vaguely stating that the electron transport is a complicated non-equilibrium process with some difficult math, basically implying that the standard rules might not perfectly apply.
But Sabine isn't buying that excuse for a second. Now, it is true that the standard model of particle physics does violate parity symmetry in certain extreme conditions.
Wait, pause right there. Let me play the role of the listener who hasn't taken physics since high school. Parity symmetry. Explain that to me like I'm 5. If I hold a mirror up to a physics experiment, what does violating parity mean?
Excellent question. Think of it like this. If you build a clock that runs clockwise, and then you build an exact mirror image replica of that clock, parity symmetry says that the mirror image clock should run perfectly, just in reverse, so counterclockwise.
Okay, that makes sense.
The laws of physics shouldn't care which version you build. For a long time, physicists believed the universe completely respected parity symmetry. But in the 1950s, scientists discovered that the weak nuclear force, which is the force responsible for radioactive decay, actually does have a slight handedness.
So it prefers a certain direction.
Yes, it prefers a certain direction. That is a violation of parity symmetry. The universe actually does have a slight left-handed bias at the subatomic level.
Okay, so the universe is slightly biased. So doesn't that mean the researchers might be right? Like maybe that subatomic bias is what's making the electrons move better in one direction in their gold film.
That is exactly the leap in logic the researchers are hoping you make. But Sabine shuts it down completely. She points out that while this parity violation exists in the weak nuclear force, the effect is incredibly, infinitesimally tiny.
How tiny?
Like, it only manifests at insanely high energies or over massive timescales. She calculates that it plays absolutely zero role at the incredibly low room temperature energies they're measuring in this tiny gold film experiment.
I see.
It's like trying to claim that the gravitational pull of a mosquito passing by your window is the reason your house collapsed. The math simply does not support the claim.
So what does this all mean? If it's not groundbreaking new physics, what actually happened in the lab?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, her conclusion is devastating for the institutional peer review process. She suspects it is far more likely that these researchers simply had a problem with their sample preparation.
Like a mundane error.
Exactly. Maybe the left-handed tartaric acid they bought was slightly more pure than the right-handed batch. Maybe the gold film oxidized slightly differently on Tuesday than it did on Wednesday. In short, it was a poorly prepped sample, a lab error that yielded an asymmetrical result.
But because that erroneous result perfectly matched the narrative they wanted to find, because it magically solved the great mystery of chirality, they published it as a breakthrough rather than questioning their own methodology.
Right, they saw what they wanted to see.
Wow. And this raises a huge, unsettling question for me. If top-tier institutional science, the people we trust to map the literal building blocks of reality, can push a broken, mathematically flawed narrative just to get a neat, headline-grabbing answer to a fundamental mystery, How much of our accepted institutional truth is just poorly prepped samples?
That is the pivotal question of this entire episode.
How much of the reality being dictated to us from the top down is just institutional bias disguised as objective fact?
And that transitions us perfectly from the manipulation of scientific truth to the manipulation of historical and societal truth. If scientists are willing to bend reality at the microscopic level to get the answers they want, what happens when the people who control the political and economic rules do the exact same thing to society at the macro level?
Which brings us to our next source. We are diving into a lecture from Predictive History, specifically a fascinating breakdown called Game Theory 26, which explores the historical concept and function of secret societies.
Now, hold on, listeners. Before you roll your eyes, let me be very clear.
Yeah, please clarify this.
When we say secret societies, we aren't talking about literal demon-summoning lizard people in cloaks sacrificing goats in the woods.
Right, no tinfoil hats required here.
Absolutely not. The professor in this lecture makes a crucial, grounding distinction right up front. The popular, sensationalized conspiracy theories, the ideas that the Illuminati are trying to summon interdimensional alien beings so the global elite can live forever, those are factually incorrect and distracting.
Right, there is no historical evidence for literal demons or a flawless, thousand-year, continuous, unbroken plot.
However, he argues something far more interesting. He argues that these wild conspiracy theories are actually highly accurate metaphors for how power operates in the real world.
Right, they are intuitive, explanatory frameworks. They might not be literally true, but they are predictively true regarding human behavior.
Exactly. Let's trace the historical trajectory the lecture lays out to show how this works. He starts all the way back with the Knights Templar in the year 1118.
Okay, taking us back.
Now, the Templars started out during the Crusades with a very specific, noble, and public mission-protecting vulnerable Christian pilgrims traveling the dangerous roads to Jerusalem.
But over time, the nature of their organization fundamentally shifted. Because they were protecting travelers who were carrying wealth, they developed a system where a pilgrim could deposit their gold with the Templars in Europe, receive a coded piece of paper, travel empty-handed and safe from bandits, and then withdraw their funds from a Templar stronghold in the Holy Land.
Right.
Without intending to, the Knights Templar effectively invented the world's first international banking system.
And with that financial monopoly came incredible, staggering wealth and political power. They became untouchable by local kings.
Wow.
The lecture then traces this lineage of power-seeking behavior through history, connecting the conceptual dots from the rise and fall of the Templars to the secretive guilds of Freemasonry, and eventually to the historical Illuminati in Bavaria.
But the core mechanism binding these groups isn't some magical, esoteric bloodline. It is a highly practical, observable economic concept, the monopolization of secrets.
To explain this, the professor uses a brilliant analogy from the modern billionaire investor Peter Thiel. Think about it. Thiel argues that if you want to build a truly great, world-altering company, competition is for losers.
Right. You don't want to open a pizza shop on a block with 10 other pizza shops. You want a monopoly. And to get a monopoly, you need a secret.
Thiel categorizes secrets into two types. There are secrets of nature, things the physical world isn't telling us, like a new algorithm or a cure for a disease. And there are secrets of humanity, things people are actively hiding about themselves or how society really functions.
I love this quote from Thiel that the lecture highlights. It's chillingly precise. He says, "Every great business is built around a secret that's hidden from the outside. A great company is a conspiracy to change the world." How do you build a great company? You create a secret society. Think about Google's original search algorithm in the late 90s. That was a monopolized secret. They didn't share it. They built an empire around it.
So the professor in the lecture applies this exact same game theory logic to the political and social elites throughout history. In any era, there are mystics, philosophers, and scientists trying to uncover the secrets of the universe, alchemy, sacred geometry, advanced physics.
Okay.
Then there are the pragmatic people who seek power, wealth, and control. These power seekers realize that they desperately need these secrets to dominate their rivals. So they form exclusive, highly vetted networks, secret societies, to hoard this knowledge, protect it from the masses, and implement it for their own benefit.
And over time, as society becomes larger, more bureaucratic, more chaotic, and more corrupt, these tight-knit, highly cohesive elite networks become exponentially more powerful.
Why is that?
Because a small group of 50 people who share a secret and a unified agenda can easily coordinate and outmaneuver a fragmented, distracted society of 50 million people who are just constantly arguing with each other.
That makes total sense.
And the lecture points out that, historically, the agenda of these elite networks is almost always the same. They desire more order, more predictability, and more control over the chaotic masses.
Which brings us to the chilling modern conclusion of this predictive history lecture, the concept of the holy empire of AI.
Okay, here we go.
The professor explains that the ultimate eschatology, like the end goal or final state of these power structures, going all the way back to the esoteric architectural goals of early Freemasonry, is to entirely eradicate human error and societal chaos.
The historical metaphor they used for centuries was building the perfect temple of God on earth. It's an architectural metaphor. But to build a perfectly stable, unshakable temple, you need perfect uniform stones. You can't build a temple with jagged, unpredictable rocks.
Right.
So the elite's goal, metaphorically, is to chip away at human nature, to turn every chaotic, emotional, subjective human being into an unthinking, perfectly stoic, obedient stone that fits neatly into their grand societal design.
They view human subjectivity, our unpredictable emotions, our conflicting desires, our free will, as the root cause of sin, error, rebellion, and inefficiency. And for centuries, they tried to enforce this compliance through religion, through strict laws, or through physical force. But it was always imperfect. Humans always rebelled.
Until now.
Yeah.
Because artificial intelligence is viewed by these modern power structures as the ultimate flawless tool to finally achieve this perfect order.
And we aren't talking about Hollywood Terminator robots shooting lasers in the streets.
Oh.
We are talking about algorithmic control. We are talking about predictive social media feeds that nudge your behavior, digital currencies that track every purchase, and surveillance systems that reward compliance and punish deviation before a crime even occurs.
Exactly. It is a system designed to perfectly manage human behavior, quietly eradicating the chaos of human choice to create a perfectly ordered, compliant, frictionless society. The drive to eliminate human chaos through technology perfectly mirrors the modern state's desire to eliminate cultural chaos through top-down policy.
Which is the perfect thematic bridge into segment 2, the societal breaking point. Because if the elites desperately want a perfectly ordered society of obedient stones, what happens when the actual breathing human beings on the ground refuse to comply?
What happens when the pressure cooker of top-down control finally explodes? Let's talk about the UK.
Now, before we dive into this next segment, we need to reiterate our morning roundup disclaimer.
Yes, very important.
We are about to analyze some highly volatile, politically charged source material regarding the recent massive civil unrest and protests in the United Kingdom. We want to be abundantly clear this show does not take political sides.
We are impartially reporting the raw sentiments of the populace and the specific arguments presented in our source videos.
Our goal is to understand the sociological forces at play and why this friction is happening, not to endorse the specific actions or ideologies of the people involved.
Absolutely. We are just the messengers here looking at the X-ray. So our sources for this segment are on-the-ground footage and real-time commentary from popular internet creators as Mongold and Nick Shirley. They are reacting to and covering the massive Unite the West march that recently took place in London.
And the scene they paint is staggering. The mainstream media might show a tight shot of a few angry people, but the wide drone shots reveal hundreds of thousands of people completely filling the streets, marching from Whitehall all the way to Parliament Square.
It is a massive physical manifestation of societal fracture.
And the state's response to this fracture is equally staggering. The footage Nick Shirley captures highlights a level of extreme mass surveillance that feels ripped straight out of the holy empire of AI concept we just discussed.
Yeah, he documents 4,000 police officers deployed, effectively acting as a standing army.
But more significantly, he zooms in on new facial recognition cameras installed at major transit hubs like King's Cross Station. These cameras are explicitly positioned to scan and track the identity of every single citizen entering and exiting the protest zone.
It's unbelievable. Nick points out these temporary high-tech camera arrays mounted on poles surrounding the protest rates, just constantly scanning the crowd, running biometric data in real time.
This is the top-down control manifesting in real physical space. If you attend a protest the government doesn't like, your face is logged in a database before you even hold up a sign.
And the rhetoric from the top absolutely matches this hostile posture. Prime Minister Keir Starmer took to the podium and explicitly labeled the organizers and attendees of this march as convicted thugs and racists, claiming they are solely out to peddle hatred and division.
But when you actually listen to the unedited interviews with the protesters on the ground, their stated grievances paint a very different, far more complex picture of what is driving this immense unrest.
Yeah, these aren't just people looking to break windows. They express a profound existential dread. They feel their country, their history, and their safety are being completely eroded. You repeatedly hear deeply emotive phrases like, the country is being raped or stolen.
One of the core complaints you hear over and over in the footage is a profound loss of free speech. Native citizens feel they are instantly punished, fired, or even arrested for expressing concerns about immigration or crime, while other groups are given a complete pass to say or do whatever they want.
They are protesting what they call two-tier policing.
Right. And this isn't just an abstract philosophical grievance. The specific tragic catalyst repeatedly mentioned by the crowd, the spark that lit this powder keg, is the murder of a young man named Henry Noak.
According to the sources and the sentiment on the ground, Noak was brutally stabbed by a Sikh man. The crowd is furious because they allege that not only did the attacker's family actively hide the murder weapon to protect him, but the police response was deeply skewed.
The protesters claim the police initially arrested the victim, Henry Noak, while he was literally bleeding out on the floor, simply because his attacker falsely accused him of saying a racial slur during the altercation.
Let that sink in. The narrative driving this crowd is that a native citizen bled to death in handcuffs while his murderer's word was taken as gospel by a police force terrified of appearing racist.
That story is echoing through this massive crowd as undeniable proof of a broken, hostile system that actively hates its legacy population.
Now let me play devil's advocate for a second. If I'm sitting in the Prime Minister's office, aren't I justified in calling this a far-right riot? Isn't it just xenophobia?
That is the easy institutional narrative. But as Mongold, watching this footage from an outside American perspective provides a much deeper sociological analysis of the inherent cultural conflict happening here.
Okay.
He points out that you cannot just dismiss this as mere racism. It is a mathematical and sociological reality. When you import massive, million-strong populations from nations shaped by strict, fundamentalist Islamic ideology into a historically Christian, liberal, secular democracy, you are guaranteeing friction.
Right. Asmongold Gold argues that it's a clash of fundamental, incompatible operating systems. You cannot have a society that prides itself on valuing things like women's equality, gay rights, and freedom of speech, and simultaneously mass import populations whose religious doctrine explicitly demands the suppression of those exact rights.
He states very clearly that eventually one of these belief systems has to overrule the other, or you are purposefully engineering a state of constant, inevitable, violent chaos. It is a failure of integration at the most basic level of values.
We also see footage in the sources of controversial figure Tommy Robinson giving a speech to the massive crowd in London. He frames this situation not as a minor political dispute over tax rates or zoning laws, but as a literal fight for survival.
He talks about the Battle of Britain in 2029, invoking the existential stakes of World War II.
He accuses the government of intentionally importing voters to permanently replace the native, troublesome population and create a new, dependent, compliant underclass. He claims that the far-left elite has already executed a successful, quiet revolution by intentionally breaking down the nuclear family and attacking national patriotism, and that this march in London is the beginning of the inevitable counter-revolution.
It is a profound, terrifying level of societal fracture. People feel like they are living in an occupied country. And this brings us to our next source, which adds specific data to these feelings.
We are looking at commentary from a creator known as Richard IV, who specifically hones in on the perceived hypocrisy of Prime Minister Keir Starmer, because nothing pours gasoline on the fire of civil unrest quite like the blatant hypocrisy of the ruling class.
Richard IV highlights a staggering double standard that the native population sees every single day. He notes that recently, when a tragic attack happened at a mosque in San Diego, which, remember, is thousands of miles away in the United States, Keir Starmer was almost instantly on Twitter.
Oh, right.
He condemned the violence, expressed deep, immediate concern for the safety of Muslims in the UK, and issued stern warnings about an environment where division and hostility are normalized.
But Richard points out that this exact same prime minister offers absolute deafening silence when native Britons are the victims of horrific, unprovoked violence in his own country.
He brings up the Henry Noak case we just discussed.
Right, and he also highlights another recent case involving a 36-year-old model named Luke Harden, who was subjected to what witnesses called a frenzied and cowardly murder by a South African national in the UK.
Richard's argument is that Starmer's definition of division and hate only applies in one direction. By actively refusing to acknowledge white Westerners as a legitimate group identity with their own valid concerns, their own safety fears, and their own victims, the political class is proving to the native population that the system does not care about them. The social contract is completely broken.
Furthermore, Richard highlights an infuriating story regarding Fatima Bayo, the current First Lady of the African nation of Sierra Leone. She moved to the UK and, according to reports, was almost immediately given a highly coveted, heavily subsidized council flat in Southwark, an expensive area of central London.
A flat that Richard notes would cost a native, working-class British citizen over £100,000 in rent to live in over a decade.
The optics of a wealthy foreign head of state's wife jumping the massive waiting list for social housing, while young native Brits are working 2 jobs and still struggling to get on the property market or afford a family. It is utterly devastating to the concept of social cohesion. It breeds deep, justified resentment.
What's fascinating here is how Richard analyzes the resulting balkanization of society. Now, if you aren't familiar with that term, balkanization refers to the violent fracturing of a state into smaller, mutually hostile groups based on ethnicity or religion, like what happened in the Balkan Peninsula in the 1990s.
We are retreating into hostile, distinct echo chambers.
Richard quotes a prominent Muslim commentator on Twitter who openly mocked the native British population's demographic collapse, calling them 1.1 birth rate dog parents.
Wow.
This commentator boasted that large traditional Muslim families will simply outpopulate, outvote, and conquer the native culture through sheer numbers without firing a shot.
And Richard points out the ultimate hypocrisy. This kind of conqueror rhetoric for minority groups is completely ignored by the state surveillance apparatus.
Yeah.
But if a native British citizen posted something similar about taking back their country, they would likely be arrested for hate speech before the end of the day.
The power structure uses the noble-sounding labels of fighting division and combating racism not to actually create a peaceful, integrated society, but as a weapon to enforce silence and compliance from the legacy population, all while radically altering the demographic reality of the nation beneath their feet.
It is exactly the kind of top-down engineering the game theory lecture warned us about in segment 1. The state demands that you behave like a perfectly compliant, silent stone, while the very fabric of your society, your safety, and your culture is dismantled and changed around you.
You are expected to suffer the consequences of their utopian policies in absolute silence.
And if these massive top-down policies fracture entire nations on the macro level, we have to zoom in. We have to see how this exact same modern cultural conditioning is fracturing the most fundamental, microscopic unit of society itself. Welcome to segment 3, the microcosm of chaos.
We are shifting our focus from the riot-torn streets of London to the quiet, desperate living rooms of America. We are looking at how the modern worldview, the exact same worldview driving the political elites, is actively, intentionally destroying the nuclear family.
Our source for this segment is a deep dive analysis by Malcolm and Simone Collins on their Based Camp channel. They are dissecting a highly viral, intensely controversial article recently published in New York Magazine's The Cut, titled, "I Regret Having Children."
Yeah, that article. It features anonymous, incredibly dark, unfiltered confessions from 3 different mothers who deeply, fundamentally wish they could go back to their old, childless lives.
It is a brutal, difficult read. I actually winced a few times reading the source material. But Malcolm and Simone argue it is essential reading because it perfectly illustrates the psychological trap of modern parenting. Let's really look at the lives of these 3 mothers to understand the anatomy of this despair.
Okay, mother number 1. She is a 34-year-old from Rhode Island with 2 kids. In her confession, she admits that she never really felt a strong, primal urge to be a mother, but her husband demanded kids as a deal breaker for their marriage, and she just sort of passively went along with it because it was the expected next stage of life.
Right, she just followed the script. But now, she struggles with severe, crippling perfectionism, a bout of severe postpartum depression, and a recently diagnosed case of ADHD.
She describes these harrowing daily situations where her toddler simply refuses to get dressed and starts screaming. And she, the adult mother, just completely shuts down. She mentally dissociates because she simply does not have the emotional toolkit to handle a screaming child. She feels like a complete failure every single morning.
Then we have mother number 2, which is a story of profound betrayal. She's a 30-year-old European mother of a 3-year-old. She had a nightmarish, high-risk pregnancy that constrained her to bed rest for months, followed by a deeply painful, traumatic physical recovery from birth.
But she says the real tragedy wasn't the physical pain, it was the absolute isolation.
This one broke my heart. Her own mother had promised to be there to help, but once the baby arrived, her mother refused to wake up at night to assist. Her husband technically had paternity leave, but he only changed diapers with a look of extreme reluctance and visible disgust. He basically checked out.
Making her feel completely unsupported, unloved, and trapped while she was literally hallucinating from sleep deprivation. She states explicitly in the article that she felt tricked by society. Everyone else around her, her husband, her friends, got to keep their freedom and their hobbies, while her freedom and her entire identity went down the toilet.
And then there is mother number 3. This is perhaps the darkest, most jarring story of the group. A 27-year-old from North Carolina with a 1-year-old son. Before having a child, she used to be a highly fit, competitive track athlete. But she suffers from severe body dysmorphia.
During her pregnancy, she felt so massive and deeply ashamed of her naturally changing body that she refused to leave the house. She viewed the pregnancy as a grotesque deformation of her athletic identity.
When her son was born, he struggled with developmental milestones. He exhibited a very low tolerance for frustration, constantly screaming, throwing tantrums, and pulling her hair.
But the core of her despair wasn't just the difficult child. It was her feeling of being completely erased as a human being. She complained bitterly that her former client suddenly just called her mama instead of using her name, and her friends only asked about the baby.
She deeply resented that her individual existence no longer seemed to matter to the outside world. And her solution to this existential crisis: she is currently finalizing plans to leave her husband, legally abandoning her child to let him be a single dad, because she absolutely refuses to live this life of self-sacrifice for one more day.
It's horrifying. But Simone and Malcolm Collins break down the root cause of this absolute misery. They don't just call these women selfish and move on. They identify the culprit as what they term the urban monoculture.
The urban monoculture, what is that exactly?
This is the dominant modern secular culture that teaches women from the moment they are born that their atomized individual identity, their personal career, their physical appearance, their self-actualization is the highest possible moral good.
Right. It frames the natural historical process of sublimating your individual self into a family unit, the act of sacrificing your ego for the sake of a child, not as a beautiful, necessary sacrifice or an expansion of your soul, but as a horrifying, tragic loss of freedom.
Interestingly, Malcolm points out a massive cultural tension here. He notes that young men often feel totally adrift and don't forge a solid identity until they form a family. Men often find their ultimate purpose and motivation through the heavy responsibility of fatherhood.
But modern women are actively conditioned by media and academia to believe that stepping into motherhood means they are losing everything that makes them valuable.
Now, you could play devil's advocate here. You could ask, are these women really victims of some insidious urban monoculture, or are they just exhausted women who lack basic childcare support? Is this cultural brainwashing, or just the reality of having no village to help raise a child?
That's a fair pushback. The lack of a village is real. But Malcolm and Simone argue that the response to that exhaustion, the desire to literally abandon the child rather than fight through the hardship, is dictated by the culture. To combat this, the Collinses offer a powerful, highly actionable concept: the absolute necessity of drafting a literal parenting contract before you ever get married or conceive.
This isn't just a romantic conversation over dinner. They mean meticulously mapping out worst-case scenarios. You sit down and ask, what happens if I have severe postpartum depression and cannot bond with the baby? Who specifically does the night shifts if the baby has colic? What if her child has severe special needs? What are our exact financial obligations to childcare?
Right. If you don't negotiate these terms explicitly, you are relying on assumed historical social contracts that simply no longer exist in our fractured culture. To give a Blinkist-level takeaway, imagine a clause in this contract. If the mother experiences sleep deprivation leading to cognitive impairment, less than 4 hours of sleep for 3 consecutive nights, the father assumes 100% of night duty, including taking time off work, no questions asked.
Having that in writing prevents the resentment that destroyed mother number 2.
Malcolm and Simone also stress the immense psychological power of contextualization. How you frame your suffering determines whether it destroys you or builds you.
Exactly. Simone provides a stunning personal example. She discusses her own struggles with body dysmorphia during pregnancy. But instead of hiding in her house feeling ashamed of her pregnancy weight like the mother in the article, Simone actively contextualized her changing body as a badge of honor.
She made a conscious decision that she was going to wear her physical body into the ground, using it to its absolute maximal biological capacity to build a family. She viewed the physical toll, the stretch marks, the exhaustion as a victory of endurance, the scars of a successful athlete, rather than a tragic loss of her vanity.
They even delve into the controversial but fascinating realm of utilizing advanced biological technologies like polygenic risk selection. For those unfamiliar, this involves screening embryos during IVF to analyze their genetic blueprints. The Collinses advocate for using this technology to actively avoid passing down heavy genetic markers for traits like severe major depression or debilitating anxiety, effectively giving your children a better baseline for happiness.
It's about taking radical, proactive responsibility for your family's future, rather than being a passive victim of a biological lottery or toxic culture.
This secular, highly pragmatic analysis of family breakdown actually aligns perfectly with the ancient spiritual guidance provided in our next source, which is a Q&A session with Orthodox Christian priest Father Josiah Trenum.
Father Josiah receives a desperate letter from a modern Christian mother asking how she should talk to her 15 and 12-year-old boys about sex without scarring them or making it weird.
His mandate is uncompromising. He tells her she absolutely must have these deeply uncomfortable conversations immediately. Because if she abandons her duty as a parent simply because she is awkward or uncomfortable, the secular schools and the internet will gladly step in to fill that void.
And he warns, in no uncertain terms, that the secular culture will actively teach her children to view the most grotesque forms of sexual perversion as completely normal and healthy.
He states that the modern culture calls good evil and evil good. He advises her not just to give a clinical biology lesson, but to actively model mature, joyful Christian sexuality in her own marriage, to show her sons that the marriage bed is blessed and honorable, referencing the biblical mandate in Hebrews 13.4.
He tells her to ask her sons what character traits they're looking for in a future wife, to keep the lines of communication wide open so they aren't blindsided by the temptations of the world.
In that same letter, the mother also confesses something very common today. She feels deep guilt because she doesn't want to have any more children. She has 2 kids, it's exhausting, she feels overwhelmed, and she wants to be done.
Father Josiah's response to this is fascinating because it completely rejects the modern framework. He acknowledges the immense, draining burden of raising kids, but he actively challenges her modern scarcity mindset. He points her to Psalms 127 and 128, where children are not described as burdens or lifestyle inhibitors, but as a profound reward, like arrows in the hand of a mighty warrior.
And then he hits her with cold, hard demographic math. He says, look, God gave you 2 beautiful children, but mathematically all you have done is replace yourself and your husband. You haven't grown the kingdom. In fact, mathematically, a society needs a birth rate of 2.1 children per woman just to keep a population from dying out and collapsing.
He reminds her that the very first command God ever gave humanity in the garden wasn't to build churches or write theology. It was simply to be fruitful and multiply.
Which brings us back to the core tension. Is our modern obsession with finding ourselves, the exact self-actualization narrative making the mothers in the New York Times article so miserable, actually the root cause of our societal collapse? Are we so obsessed with our atomized individual identity that we are literally mathematically breeding ourselves out of existence?
It's a compelling, terrifying argument.
Yep.
But it leaves us with a desperate question. If the modern world, the urban monoculture, the state surveillance, the AI algorithms, is perfectly designed to make you isolated, miserable, self-obsessed, and ultimately compliant to those top-down systems we discussed earlier, how do you actually build the internal strength to resist? How do you survive this?
Which brings us to segment 4, the spiritual gym and the liturgical memory. You cannot just passively hope to survive this cultural meat grinder. You have to actively train your soul.
Our source here begins with Father Tryphon, an Orthodox monk who uses a brilliant, highly accessible modern analogy, the spiritual gym.
He observes that millions of people casually call themselves Christians, but their practice consists of just showing up on a Sunday, throwing a few bucks in the offering plate, sitting passively in the pew for an hour, and then going home and complaining to God that nothing in their life is changing, that they still feel anxious and empty.
Father Tryphon says this is exactly like walking into a heavy weightlifting gym, paying a monthly subscription fee, standing in the lobby drinking a smoothie, and then being furious at the gym owner that you aren't building any muscle.
You have to do the heavy lifting. God gave humanity free will, and free will demands active, grueling participation. If you don't pray daily, if you don't fast to train your bodily desires, if you don't engage in the painful inner work of repentance, God is not going to magically force spiritual growth upon you. He won't lift the weights for you.
Father John Hamadi, another traditional priest in our sources, expands on this concept beautifully by looking at how generational habits, both good and bad, shape us. He tells a hilarious but profound story about growing up in a loud, passionate Mediterranean household where everyone yelled about everything.
Oh man, this hit home for me. He says, I grew up in a house of yelling, and therefore I yell.
It's so true. My dad used to do this weird, passive-aggressive throat-clearing thing whenever he was frustrated driving. And the other day, someone cut me off in traffic, and I caught myself doing the exact same throat clear. The sins, the anxieties, and the habits of the parents transfer directly to the children. You cannot tell your kids, do as I say, not as I do. They absorb your actual behavior.
Exactly. And Father John applies this psychological reality directly to faith. He warns parents that if you casually arrive 15 minutes late to church every Sunday because you couldn't be bothered to wake up early, you are actively, permanently teaching your children that the worship of the creator of the universe is just not that important.
If you don't plan, if you treat the ancient liturgy as a minor inconvenience to squeeze in between soccer games, your kids will absorb that underlying apathy, and, to show, they will eventually abandon the faith entirely.
To combat this apathy, Father John strictly adheres to what he calls the rule of one. One liturgy, one altar, one priest, one day. He absolutely refuses to rush the Sunday service or offer a quick, convenient 45-minute secondary service just to accommodate busy modern schedules or people who want to beat the lunch rush.
He draws a sharp contrast between traditional Orthodox temple worship, which he notes is rooted directly in the incredibly strict, detailed commandments of the Old Testament book of Leviticus, and the modern Protestant reduction of worship. Points out that much of modern worship has been reduced to simply a guy reading scripture and a rock band singing contemporary, emotionally driven songs.
And he explains the history of why that happened. He notes that early Christians didn't abandon the elaborate temple worship voluntarily. They only reduced their worship to secretive scripture reading because they were hiding in the catacombs from violent Roman persecution. They literally didn't have access to a temple or incense.
But he argues that over centuries, Protestantism mistook that emergency, stripped-down survival tactic for the ideal desired form of worship.
For Father John, true worship takes time. It is supposed to be heavy because it is about standing in the literal, terrifying presence of God. It is not about rushing through a self-help checklist so you can feel good about yourself.
And he anchors this demand for spiritual resilience with an incredibly powerful, tear-jerking personal story. In 2007, his youngest son was involved in a horrific, traumatic accident that resulted in his leg being amputated above the knee.
Any parent's worst nightmare.
But years later, the son told his father an incredible realization. He said that losing his leg was actually the best thing that ever happened to him. Because if he had continued down the wild, destructive, rebellious path he was currently on, he confidently believed he would have ended up dead or in prison within a year.
God, in his mercy, physically stopped him. He lost a physical leg, but the trauma broke his pride and saved his eternal soul. It is the ultimate extreme example of what Simone Collins was talking about earlier, contextualizing deep tragedy, not as a reason for nihilistic despair, but as a harsh, necessary mechanism for salvation.
This deep need for unshakable generational roots brings us to our next source, Pastor Paul Vanderklay, who brilliantly explores the concept of liturgical memory.
Vanderklay critiques the modern, seeker-sensitive church's obsession with hyper-contemporary services. You know, the ones, smoke machines, laser lights, constantly updating the music and the branding to chase whatever the newest cultural trend is. He argues that if a church is constantly updating its style to stay relevant, it actively deprives its children of any inherited roots. They have no spiritual anchor.
He points out the profound incarnational reality that when his children sing the ancient hymns in his church, they are vibrating their vocal cords to the exact same melodies and the exact same theological words that their ancestors sang 1,000 years ago. It physically connects them to a reality larger than their current moment.
He discusses the profound cultural anxiety in the West over the rapid loss of these ancient institutions. He references deep debates within the Church of England, citing public intellectuals like Roger Scruton and theologian Leslie Newbigin.
These men watched the rapid, aggressive secularization of British society and recognized a terrifying truth. Without a shared, established, ancient religious framework, a society completely loses its moral anchor and descends into the friction we saw in London.
To illustrate the power of this lost tradition, van der Klee shares this fascinating, beautiful historical anecdote about the late Queen Elizabeth. During the traditional Maundy Thursday service before Easter, the literal Queen of England, the monarch with immense wealth and power, would publicly wash the feet of her poor subjects.
He notes that she wasn't just doing a photo op. She was embodying a massive, paradoxical 2,000-year-old history, where the absolute greatest and most powerful among us is explicitly called to be the lowest, most humble servant.
But, and this is the tragic part, when the society stops believing in the underlying metaphysical truth of that ritual, when they just see it as an old lady washing feet, it ceases to be a cultural anchor and just becomes empty, absurd theater.
And this deep hunger for unyielding, demanding tradition is driving a fascinating cultural shift that van der Klee calls the orthobros phenomenon. We are seeing thousands of young men who are completely disillusioned with the chaotic, relativistic, find-yourself modern world, flocking to the strict, demanding ancient traditions of Eastern Orthodoxy.
They aren't looking for a church that tells them they are perfect just the way they are. They are looking for the Benedict option. This is a concept popularized by writer Rod Dreher, advocating that traditional Christians need to build high, thick, cultural and spiritual walls of tradition to protect their families and preserve sanity, while the secular society around them goes completely mad.
Which leads us perfectly into our final segment. We have seen all this truth. We have the data on the broken families, the historical warnings about top-down control, the ancient traditions offering a lifeline. So why do so many people look directly at this crumbling reality and absolutely refuse to see it? Why do they stay in the burning building? Second 5. Epistemology, blindness, and the limits of argument.
Our source here is a striking sermon by Father Moses, and he centers it on the famous biblical story from the Gospel of John about the man born blind. And Father Moses clarifies a crucial, often overlooked physiological detail. This man wasn't just visually impaired with bad cataracts. The Greek text implies he was born literally without eyes. He had empty sockets.
So when Jesus encounters him and heals him, it's not just clearing up blurry vision. Jesus spits in the dirt, makes clay, rubs it into the man's empty sockets, and physically creates brand new, functioning biological eyeballs out of raw matter. It is a stunning demonstration of his power as the literal creator of the physical universe.
It is an undeniable, explosive public miracle. You would logically think that the entire community, upon seeing a man who had no eyes suddenly blinking at them, would fall on their knees in awe and worship. But the human reaction in the story is pathetic and deeply revealing. The religious authorities summon the man's own parents to testify.
And instead of jumping for joy and celebrating that their son has eyes, they cower in fear. They know it's a miracle, but they're terrified of losing their social status. They know that acknowledging Jesus will get them thrown out of the synagogue, which was basically the first century equivalent of being completely canceled and economically ruined.
So they refuse to testify. They literally throw their newly healed son under the bus and tell the authorities he's of age, ask him, just to protect their own comfort.
But the reaction of the Pharisees, the educated elite religious leaders, is even worse. They aggressively interrogate the healed man, they try to discredit his moral character by calling him a sinner, and they completely aggressively refuse to accept the physical reality of the miracle that is staring them right in the face.
Father Moses says this story is the ultimate, timeless example of spiritual blindness.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Father Moses argues that spiritual blindness is fundamentally a choice. It's not a lack of evidence, it's a lack of will. The Pharisees refused to see the miracle because acknowledging that the Creator God was standing in front of them meant they would have to yield control.
Exactly. If you acknowledge the reality of Christ, you have to become what St. Paul calls a slave to Christ. You have to give up absolute control of your life, your schedule, your sexual desires, your bank account, and your ego. And Father Moses points out that most people would rather live in absolute comfortable darkness than surrender their autonomy to a higher power.
This brings us to a crucial, incredibly practical takeaway for our listeners. You cannot argue someone into belief. Father Moses notes that we all engage in this kind of magical thinking, believing that if we just find the perfect debate tactic, the flawless logical syllogism, or the ultimate gotcha fact, we can force someone to change their mind on politics or religion.
But Jesus didn't do that. When the Pharisees refused to believe the eyeballs in front of them, Jesus didn't scream at them. He didn't pull out a whiteboard and debate them. He spoke the truth, and then he just let them be blind.
Stop trying to find the magic formula to control other people's minds. It doesn't exist. This perfectly sets up our next source, Christian philosopher J. Dyer. who takes this ancient concept of chosen blindness and applies it directly to modern intellectual atheism, specifically targeting famous new atheist thinkers like Sam Harris.
Dyer dissects Harris's attempt to create a purely secular, objective morality. Harris famously argues that we don't need God for morality. He says the objective baseline for good should simply be avoiding the maximal suffering of conscious creatures.
Sounds reasonable, right?
Sounds reasonable till you poke it. Dyer asks the fatal question, where does that baseline axiom come from? Why is maximal suffering objectively bad in a completely random, godless, materialist universe where we are just accidental meat computers?
Yeah.
A lion doesn't care about the maximal suffering of a gazelle. Dyer accuses these atheist thinkers of epistemic bootstrapping. Wait, stop. Epistemic bootstrapping. That sounds like something a philosophy major mumbles at a party before passing out. Explain that to me like I'm a normal person. What does that mean?
It's actually a great visual metaphor. Imagine Wile E. Coyote running off a cliff. He's hovering in midair, and he suddenly decides he wants to build a brick house right there in the sky. He has no foundation, nothing holding him up, but he just starts laying bricks in the air, hoping the sheer act of building will somehow create ground beneath him. Or, literally, trying to pull yourself up into the air by yanking on your own shoelaces.
That is what Sam Harris is doing with morality. He has discarded the foundation, a moral lawgiver, but he still desperately wants to build the house of objective morality. So he just artificially invents an axiom suffering is bad out of thin air to pull his worldview up by its own bootstraps.
Wow, that's a perfect analogy. Dyer points out that this kind of naive empiricism fails entirely. If your foundational axioms are broken, relativistic, or merely subjective evolutionary preferences, your entire worldview is logically self-refuting.
And here's the kicker. If you point out to a relativist that their position is logically self-refuting, like saying there is no absolute truth is an absolute truth statement, and they still choose to hold it, you have done your job. You cannot force them to see the logic if they are emotionally committed to the blindness.
Which brings us to our final source, a profound discussion from the Right Response Ministry on knowing your proper place and calling within reality. They talk about a modern disease they call the flattening of vocations.
It's a brilliant critique of modern ambition. Society lied to entire generations of young people by telling them that absolutely everyone must go to a four-year college, regardless of their mechanical aptitude, their interests, or their finances. They framed a university degree as the only valid, respectable path to success, completely denigrating the trades and causing massive student debt.
And the tragedy is that the modern church adopted the exact same toxic, flattening mindset. They told every ambitious, zealous, well-spoken 22-year-old young man who loves the Lord that his default, unquestioned path must be to become a lead pastor.
The hosts of Right Response cite Pastor Albert Martin, who ran a highly successful church with hundreds of people. He had perhaps 50 men in his congregation who met all the strict biblical qualifications for leadership. They were sober-minded, faithful husbands, good teachers. But out of those 50 qualified men, Pastor Martin noted that only a tiny, tiny fraction were actually called and uniquely gifted by God to bear the crushing weight of being the primary preacher.
The profound lesson here is that inward desire must be ruthlessly tested against actual external competence in reality. Just because you have a burning passion for something, whether it's preaching or being a CEO or being a musician, does not automatically mean you are designed or meant to rule over it. You have to accept the reality of natural hierarchy and your specific God-given limitations, rather than letting modern ego drive you into a role that will eventually crush you because you aren't equipped for it.
It is the ultimate rejection of the Disney, you can be anything you want to be if you just believe cultural narrative. True maturity, true freedom is recognizing the reality of your specific design and joyfully submitting to it.
Okay. Wow. We have covered an absolute mountain of ground today on the Morning Roundup. From Kyle Gold films and the terrifying esoteric goals of the holy empire of AI to mass surveillance on the streets of London, the devastating confessions of regretful mothers, the necessity of the spiritual gym, and the profound lessons of the man born blind. It is time for our Morning Roundup action steps. How do we take this massive stack of information and actually apply it to our daily lives?
Action step number 1, define your contract. Whether you are entering a marriage, deciding to have children, or committing to a local community, do not rely on unspoken, fuzzy societal norms that no longer exist. Map out your absolute non-negotiables beforehand. Build your personal rule of one like Father John, or establish a foundational prayer rule like Father Josiah suggested. A strict spiritual discipline that you commit to doing on your absolute worst, most exhausting days, not just when you feel inspired. Put the clause in the contract before the crisis hits.
Action step number 2. Stop debating pigeons. Recognize the harsh reality of spiritual and ideological blindness. Stop wasting your precious mental and emotional energy trying to magically argue people out of positions that they didn't use reason to get into in the first place. You cannot force someone to see the miracle if they prefer the safety of the dark. Focus that energy instead on building up the walls of your own spiritual gym.
Action step number 3, choose your contextualization. You are going to face suffering in this life. That is a guarantee. You can choose to view your societal anxieties, your physical limitations, or your family struggles as a meaningless tragedy that erases your unique identity. Or, exactly like Simone Collins embracing her pregnancy, or Father John's son losing his leg, you can actively choose to use that exact same suffering as heavy resistance training to build a legacy, forge your character, and ultimately save your soul.
And before we sign off, as always on the Morning Roundup, we want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over on your commute or while you drink your coffee.
We spent the first segment of this deep dive terrified of the political elites and the esoteric holy empire of AI taking away our freedom by force, forcing us to be perfectly compliant stones in their temple. But based on everything we've discussed today about the weakness of human nature, what if the ultimate AI system isn't going to have to enslave us at all?
Oh man. What if, exactly like the Pharisees who actively chose the comfortable, predictable blindness of their strict rules over the messy, terrifying reality of the miracle standing right in front of them, we will willingly and eagerly hand over our human subjectivity to an AI? What if we literally beg the machine to manage our schedules, filter our news, and make all our moral decisions, just so we never have to feel the exhausting, painful responsibility of being truly free?
Man, that is a heavy thought. An X-ray machine for the soul that we voluntarily plug ourselves into just to avoid the muddy waters of reality.
Thank you all so much for joining us on this edition of Morning Roundup. We highly encourage you, as always, to not just take our word for it. Dive into the original source material we discussed today. The links are in the description. Challenge your own worldview. And please, if you found value in this conversation, hit that like, subscribe, and share button to help us grow the show. We'll see you on the next deep dive.